Europe a go-go. These days, when I'm asked if I've been to any of the Scandinavian countries, my reply is yes, but does a flying and ferrying visit covering 3 countries in 3 days really count? Copenhagen, Oslo and Stockholm, with a gig in each one and probably a couple of hangovers in between. My memories of these places are as follows. Entering a hotel in Copenhagen and finding a gift from Carlsberg at the side of my bed. It was a large Carlsberg bottle top in presentation box that doubled as a bottle opener that now resides in my kitchen drawer and is still used today. I recall an overnight ferry to Oslo straight after the gig and having a few Carlsberg elephant beers on board before hitting the tour bus bunk. Oslo? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I remember that we stayed at the Grand Hotel in Stockholm and that it had water and boats in front of it, and that after the gig we went to a nearby casino and played roulette for an hour, but the Scandinavian story ends there. Thousands of years of history and culture and I can't manage more than the poxy paragraph. Hardly Lonely Planet, is it? I have a theory that your brain's like computer RAM and that you only have so much room, and when new stuff pops in then something has to be dumped out. I guess Scandinavia was dumped out. Apologies. Our next stop was Hamburg and we had a day off before the show and managed to do a bit of sightseeing. I do remember a bit more about this, probably due to visiting the red light area. Like Amsterdam, the Reeperbahn is not that seedy and has tourists who are more interested in snapping photographs rather than G-strings. We were drinking in a bar next to what can only be described as an underground car park. We have a few beers and all stroll through to check it out. There are about 50 or more girls all dressed in their underwear, and the whole place is lit by ultraviolet light that makes all the ladies seem a lot more appealing than they probably were in daylight. After walking through here, we were taken to Herberstrasse by Ian Jeffries. This is a street closed off at both ends, and all the way along its length are houses where the ladies sit in the window to ply their trade. We stroll through there and back to the main drag and decide we can't leave without visiting a live sex show. This has to be one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen. There must be about 20 of us and we all pile in and grab a few tables near the back and order more beer. The show starts. The music from 2001 crackles out the shitty PA system and a half-naked girl comes on stage and drapes herself over a couch, posing erotically and opening her legs so we can admire her hairstyle and almost see what she's had for breakfast. She's followed a minute later by a guy in a light blue and gold glittery jumpsuit wearing a crash helmet with a black visor. A bit of stroking and posturing ensues and he's unzipped and prepares for touchdown. The theme from 2001 crossfades into some fake Giorgio Moroder synthesized disco and Fritz Armstrong takes off his white helmet so we can see where he's putting his red one. He should have kept it on because now we can see his face and see how utterly bored he is by the whole affair as he pumps the woman in time with Giorgio. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry and thought that the laughter wouldn't have gone down too well, so I left with a few others and missed the climax of the show. I bet you're now thinking to yourself, this fucker can't remember a single thing about 3 gigs in Scandinavia, yet remembers in enormous detail 10 minutes of a shitty sex show on the Reeperbahn. Hey, I got no control over my RAM. The saddest thing about this night out is that guys in a band from Liverpool spent an entire evening on the Reeperbahn and the Beatles were never mentioned once. The gig the following night was our first exposure to our German fans and they loved it. Their enthusiasm for Frankie matched the British, but after our first German show we didn't get to hang out with any of them because we were whisked straight onto the tour bus for a drive through the corridor to Berlin. Back in the days when it was still surrounded by a wall, there were several corridors that linked the west with the east. Ian Jeffries had done this journey many times before, and before we left Hamburg he jumped on the bus with a box of t-shirts. He explained that our journey to Berlin would be monitored and that to make things go smoothly at the checkpoints it was always good to have a bit of merchandising to trade. We crossed into the east and went to our bunks to sleep, but Ian told us to have our passports handy. By the time we reached the checkpoint at the eastern side of Berlin, most of us had dropped off to sleep, but we were woken in a rather rude fashion. The curtain on my bunks pulled back and a torch shone into me face. This wakes me up rather quickly, and as I'm emerging from my slumber I realise there's a German shepherd in a muzzle with his face about 6 inches from mine. I hold up my passport next to me face for confirmation, and the guard and his dog move on to the next bunk. It was like something out of The Great Escape, and you're half expected to hear someone shout, "Seize him!" followed by machine gun fire and barking dogs. At least we didn't have to get out of bed, and I think this was probably due to the big box of shirts that were donated to the border guards. The Frankie Say shirts were just as popular in Germany, and I would imagine they'd have fetched a decent price on the eastern side of Berlin for the few that could afford them. I remember seeing The Promise for the first time in Berlin. I sneaked out and watched their set from the mixing desk and was standing next to Fish, who was still the singer in Marillion at that time. He was a sound fella, and Paul and I had met up with him the year before when we travelled to Middlesbrough to open up a branch of HMV with DJ Gary Crowley. Marillion were recording in Berlin at the time, and it was nice that he popped in to see the show. We had a couple of beers with him backstage and then went out on the town. It was during this part of the tour that some of us took to sleeping on the tour bus rather than staying in the posh hotels that we were booked into. We were developing a routine of arriving at the venue to do a sound check and then grabbing a bit of dinner with the crew. We had caterers cooking at the venue for all the boys, so it was no trouble for them to knock out a couple more for the band. It was good to spend a bit of time socialising with the crew, and this was the only time that was available to us both apart from the odd day off when they would join us for a few beers. Holly never did sound check, so we wouldn't see a lot of him until we got to the venue for the show and we would meet in the dressing room. We'd leave the gig and go back to the hotel to shower and change, and instead of taking our suitcases off the tour bus, we'd just take in a wash bag and a change of clothes for after the show. The reason for not staying overnight at most of the hotels was the early start the next day. The last thing you'd want to do after a gig and a night on the beer would be to get up early with a head like a box of frogs, pack your suitcases and climb aboard the bus. We'd often stay out late partying, and then, instead of sleeping in the hotel, we'd get on the bus at 2 or 3 in the morning and sleep in our bunks instead. A bed's a bed, whether it's a bunk or a 5-star mattress, and after a skinful of ale I defy anyone to tell the difference. This meant no wake-up call until you woke naturally in transit or arrived at the next destination. The tour moved on to Dusseldorf and then Paris, where a day off, like most on the tour, would be spent doing interviews with press, radio and TV. It was great that people wanted to help us spread the word, but the questions were becoming tedious, and interviewing all 5 of us together had often descended into farce. Try answering a question when you have the interviewer asking in French. It's being translated via an earpiece into English, and Mark and Ped are trying to punch it in the kidneys. These press commitments meant that any sightseeing was mostly restricted to the hotel bar and anything we could glimpse between there and the venue. We played a sold-out show at Le Zenith in Paris, a large venue a bit like a tent, and originally intended to be a temporary structure, but its success means it's still there today. Next stop, Brussels, and a date at the Forest National. I knew of this venue because it was where Bowie had started his Serious Moonlight tour in 1983, and I'd contemplated going over there to see it via a travel company who advertised in the Liverpool Echo. For me, it was a measure of how big the band was becoming if we were playing the same venues as Bowie. We travelled to Munich for a show at the Olympia Halle, stopping off at Rotterdam and Frankfurt for 2 other shows on the way. I remembered watching the Munich Olympics as a child, and it was great to see the iconic glass roof venues of the Olympic complex. The Olympic Stadium was familiar because as a football fan, I'd seen many highlights of European games featuring Bayern Munich, and the 1974 World Cup final had been played there. My memory of playing in Munich, apart from the amazing venue, was seeing a German couple getting a bit carried away during our encore performance of Relax. In these huge venues, the seating for spectators usually stops on line with the stage, and the backstage end of the hall is usually screened off with huge curtains. I remember walking off after the show and Ian Jeffries dragging us to one side saying, "Come and check this out." We walked to the side of the backstage area and he shines a huge torch up into the top layer of seating. It's quite a distance, but there's no mistaking what was going on. A guy was sitting in a seat with a girl bouncing up and down on top of him, wearing what looked like a wedding dress. They must have seen the light from Ian's torch hitting them, but it certainly wasn't putting them off the stroke. We were cracking up, and I was thinking that this guy was showing so much gusto for the task in hand that maybe he should have moved to Hamburg and applied for Fritz Armstrong's job. The European leg of the tour terminates at the next stop in Basel, and we're off for a couple of weeks before it's due to resume in America. In the time we'd spent in rehearsals for the tour, we had a few ideas for some new tunes. We also had a few ideas from dabbling with the toys in the lad's gaff, and as we couldn't return to England, it was suggested that we find somewhere to record these new ideas and have a bit of a break at the same time. From Switzerland, we flew to mainland Spain, and from there to the Sunshine Island of Ibiza. There was a studio there called Mediterranean that belonged to Judas Priest, and it was more than equipped to record some demos. Sun, Studio in San Antonio. 5 tickets, please, and one for French John.